Greetings, it is I, Tempest, Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome! Today I'm continuing talking about the history of Magic the Gathering. We're moving into the Tempest block, part of the Rath cycle, and that means we're moving into talking about, of course, Tempest, the first in the set. Now, Tempest was released on October 13th of 1997. It was a 350 card set, and as I said, it was the first in the Tempest block. It was the second set to continue the Weatherlight Saga storyline, which had established in the previous set of Weatherlight. It also showed about the Weatherlight's crew's adventures in the Plane of Rath. Now, there were some major themes introduced in this set. The first was Lishids, the second was Slivers, Spikes, and Flowstone. I'm going to get into details about each of those a little later. And they had two keywords they introduced in this set: Shadow and Buyback. Again, I'll talk about those in more depth a little later. Now, this set showed a significant jump in the power level of cards overall, and there are some cards in this set that are still used in tournaments today. They became tournament staples and have stayed that way. A thing about this set is, also, this was the first set since Antiquities that Richard Garfield, the creator of Magic, was one of the designers on. So he's actually a designer on this set, and he hadn't really been in design since Antiquities. Think about that. Now, when it was marketed, it was really marketed more as a standalone set of the expert level of play. When they kind of came up with this system of beginner, standard, expert levels that they've been talking about at this point in time, that was the expert level, was what this set was. Now, it was sold in, of course, 60 card starters, because they were still selling them in that, 15 card booster packs, just as they had been for the previous sets, but this set introduced 4 pre-constructed decks. Now, what this meant was, Wizards came up with 4 pre-constructed decks that were meant to show off what Tempest had to offer, made out of cards from the Tempest block, and they were sold individually. So they were pre-made decks that were being sold off. And each of them came with a booklet that described what kind of strategies each of these decks would use in order to make it successful. Now, when we talk about booklets sold with it, the booklet that was put out with the starter deck, which normally is a rules book that comes with the starter decks, this one was a little more unique. It assumed that most people would either have an understanding of the rules from 5th edition or would have someone around in order to teach them some of the rules. So it had a small summary of the actual rules and then moved into really talking about the new stuff that was introduced in these sets. The rest of the book, a big chunk of it, was to introduce people to the storyline of Tempest and to introduce people to the various characters which were important to it. Now, there were 3 different artworks that were put onto the booster packs, and this was the first set that had a special card as part of the pre-release. It had Dirt Cow Worm, and it had a version of it that had a little symbol on it, and it said pre-release. It didn't look any differently otherwise. Nowadays, when they have pre-release specials, usually they're foil. Wasn't foil, but this was the first set to have a special pre-release card that you would get if you participated in the pre-release for Tempest. Now, there was a book called The Official Guide to Tempest that was put out alongside with Tempest that you could use to figure out different strategies for using the cards. It had full-color pictures of all the cards. It would have strategies for deck building, using the cards, and combining them with 5th edition, so with the core set. Now, let's talk about the themes and, of course, the keywords. Now, for the themes, we had Slivers. Slivers are a creature type that was introduced in Tempest, and it was throughout the Tempest block, but it has shown up in various times throughout the Magic history. Sliver's special ability is that when you have a Sliver in play, it gives an ability to all Slivers, including itself. So it could say that all Slivers get +1/+1, or they all get Vigilance, they all get First Strike. Whatever ability all of them get, when that Sliver comes into play, it grants it to every other one. Second is, of course, Flowstone. Flowstone was a red-specific ability that existed. Flowstone, anything with Flowstone, you could pay 1 mana to give something +1, -1 until end of turn, and you could keep paying mana on a lot of Flowstone things. So Flowstone things were, you would sacrifice toughness for power, was the effective way that it worked. There was also called Lishids. Lishids were these creatures that would become enchantment auras that you could attach to another creature, and sometimes they would have the ability to turn back into a creature. And when they were attached to a creature, they would grant that creature an ability. So effectively, you would throw a Lishid onto another one of your creatures and grant it something for having that Lishid attached to it. And sometimes, if you needed to, you could remove it. And of course, there was spikes. Now, in Tempest, there was only one spike, but it introduced these creatures that they would be a theme throughout all of the Tempest blocks. So more spikes were indeed published after this. A spike was a 0/0 creature that came into play with a number of +1/+1 counters on it. And the basic ability it had was to move a +1/+1 counter from itself to something else. And later on, more of them in the upcoming sets would have more abilities based around the fact that they moved around +1/+1 counters. Now, for keyword abilities, they had buyback. Buyback was on instants or sorceries, and effectively what it is you'd pay the normal mana cost for casting this instant or sorcery, and if you chose to pay the buyback cost, instead of placing that instant or sorcery when it's finished resolving in your graveyard, you returned it to your hand. So effectively, you paid a cost to keep getting it back, to buy it back. And the other keyword ability was Shadow. If a creature had Shadow, it could only block or be blocked by other creatures with Shadow. So effectively, it was in this other existence that only other Shadow creatures could interact with. Now, it did introduce a couple of other things, which I'm not going to go into depths about because they weren't very important in this set, but were important in other sets in the block. It introduced enchantments, which would have counters on them that would grow their ability depending on the amount of counters, and spells that would grow in ability the more times you played copies of that spell, which would mean I would play that spell, and the next time I would play the same copy of that spell, it would have an enhanced ability because I had the previous one already in my graveyard. And now there were some things in this set which were counted as reprints but were different. They reprinted a bunch of types of cards which had been previously out, but versions of them with buyback. For example, they had Elvish Fury in comparison to Giant Growth. Elvish Fury gave a bonus to a creature, but you could buy it back to your hand, while Giant Growth just gave a bonus and went away. Now, there were 11 cycles in this block. The first cycle was Slow Lands. Slow Lands you could tap for colorless, or you could tap for one of the two allied colors, so it was a non-basic land which tapped for two different allied colors, but when you tapped for one of the allied colors, it would not untap during your next untap step. It also reintroduced the cycle, of course, Circle of Protections. Circle of Protections were back. They hadn't been printed since Ice Age. They were reprinted now. Next up, there was the Double Hoser cards. Effectively, what this would be is a card of a certain color that would affect both enemy colors in a negative manner. So, for example, if it was a green card, it would affect both blue and black negatively. Now, there were Pain Lands. Pain Lands tap for colorless, similar to the Slow Lands. But instead of tapping for allied colors, they would tap for enemy colors. And when you tap for one of the enemy colors instead of colorless, you would take 1 damage. Now, there were 2 different cycles of gold-colored cards. The first cycle was allied gold-colored cards, and there was actually a cycle of enemy gold-colored cards, effectively multicolored cards. There, of course, the cycle of Lycids, 1 of every color. There was medallions. These were a set of artifacts that for each, when you had one of these artifacts in play, whenever you cast a spell of whatever color it says on that artifact, it cost 1 colorless less to play. So if I had the blue version of a medallion, then all my blue spells would cost 1 colorless less to play. There were then 2 cycles of slivers. There was the uncommon slivers, which were 2/2 creatures for 2 colorless, 1 of whatever color mana. So there was 1 of each color mana, and they would give an ability to all their slivers. And there was a common cycle of slivers that were each 1 of each color mana that would give their abilities to all others that were for 1 colorless, 1 of whatever color it would be in. Now, when we move into talking about the theme decks, just briefly, I just want to mention what colors they were and what they were called. There was a blue-white one called Deep Freeze. There was a white-red one called Flames of Wrath. There was a blue-black one called the Slivers. And there was a green-white one called the Swarm. Now, this set did see some reprints and functional reprints, just like a lot of previous sets. They were trying to add in some of the core cards now that they didn't want to print so many in the core sets like they had, because they had learned from some of the mistakes of like 5th edition that it was that 4th and 5th edition were very bloated sets that they wanted to make sure they didn't get too big. They made sure to have some reprints and functional reprints in every set that they were putting out at this point in time, and Tempest saw its share of them. So let's talk about some of the cards that were out in Tempest. There was Verdant Forts. It was a 7/7 green creature. At the beginning of each upkeep, you get a 1/1 sapling token creature into play. So every upkeep that happens, not just your own, you get a sapling. There's, of course, Cold Storage. For 3 mana, you could exile a creature you control. The thing about cold storage is then you can sacrifice it and return all creatures exiled with cold storage to play under your control. So if you want to do some kind of board wipe, you put them into cold storage temporarily. There was Cursed Scroll. For 3 mana and tapping it, you could name a card that's in your hand. Then you revealed a card from your hand at random, and if it was the card that you had named, you do 2 damage to target creature or player. So effectively, if you have very few cards in hand, you have a very good chance of damaging someone with Cursed Scroll. There was Earthcraft. You could tap an untapped creature you control to untap a basic land of your choice. So you could change your creatures that you weren't using into mana with basic lands. There's Humility. Humility had all creatures lose all abilities they had, and they changed their base power and toughness to 1/1. So it made them smaller and lost abilities. There's Lotus Petal. Lotus Petal costs you 0 to play, so it's a free artifact to put out, and you could sacrifice it to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. There's Tradewind Rider, which you could tap it and tap 2 untapped creatures you control to return target permanent to its owner's hand. There's Dothy's Embrace. It's an enchantment that you could pay 2 black to give target creature Shadow until end of turn. So there's an enchantment that you can give things Shadow. There's Overrun. It is a staple of green decks that has always sort of been around. There's different versions of it now, but you play it, all your creatures get +3/+3 and trample until end of turn. There's a reason that's a kind of staple of green decks. There's Field of Souls. When a non-token creature is put in your graveyard, you get a 1/1 Flying Spirit token into play. Wasteland. You can tap it for a colorless, or you can sacrifice it to destroy target non-basic land. This is sort of a redo of Strip Mine to make it slightly less powerful, but still have that ability in play. There's Ancient Tomb. It is similar to previous play in lands, except rather than tapping for colors, you could tap it for 2 colorless, and it deals 2 damage to you. So if you want to tap it for any mana, you're getting 2, but taking 2 damage. There's Diabolic Edict. Target player sacrifices a creature. Simple as that. There's Grindstone. You 3, tap it. Target player puts the top 2 cards of his or her library in their graveyard. If it shares a color, you repeat this process. So if you keep getting the person, especially if they're in a monocolor deck, a deck with only 1 color, they can keep repeating this process over and over again, grinding them away. There's Intuition. You search your library for 3 cards, you reveal those cards, and target opponent chooses 1 of them, which you put into your hand, and the other 2 go into your graveyard. There's Scroll Rack. You tap 1 mana, you tap it. You exile any number of cards from your hand. You then draw from the top of your library that exact number of cards. Then you take the cards that you had exiled with Scroll Rack, and you put them in any order back on top of your library. So effectively, you can sort of cycle through cards and switch them out if you want to, so you can figure out what cards you want, especially if you have a large hand. There's the Death Pits of Wrath. Whenever a creature takes damage, it is destroyed, it cannot be regenerated. It's very mean to creatures. There's Miri's Guile. Miri's Guile, at the beginning of your upkeep, you can look at the top 3 cards of your library and rearrange them and put them back in any order you wish. So it's a good way to see what's upcoming and sort of rearrange it as you need to. There's Eladrimir, Lord of Leaves. He's a 2/2 legend that counts as an elf, and he gives all elves Forest Walk and Shroud. There's Time Warp. You take an extra turn after this one. Simple as that. It was replacing Time Walk and making it a little more reasonable. It's much more higher casting cost than 2. There's Apes of Wrath. It's actually a joke on Grapes of Wrath. There are some other cards in this set that have little jokes to their names and things like that, or hints at some of the designers' names. Regardless, this one, when it attacks, it doesn't untap during your next untap step. There's Oratog. It's an Atog. Atogs are still around. This one you can sacrifice an enchantment to give it +2/+2. There's, of course, Capsize. It's a buyback spell that you can return a creature to its owner's hand. So you can pay enough mana, you can keep buying it back and keep on returning creatures to its owner's hand, regardless if it's your own or someone else's. There's another legend, Commander Grevin Ilvek. He's a 7/5 that has fear, and when he comes into play, you have to sacrifice a creature. So pretty decent. Now there's Disturb Burial, another buyback spell for you. This one, you return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. For a Graveyard Resurrection deck, Disturb Burial is one of those staples. There's Dregs of Sorrow. Dregs of Sorrow, you destroy X non-black creature and draw X cards. So it's a good way of destroying a lot of creatures and drawing some cards. Furnace of Wrath. Whenever a source would deal damage to a creature or player, it deals double that damage. It burns everything. Ouch. There's Propaganda. Whenever an opponent wishes to attack you with a creature, for each creature he or she is attacking you with, they must pay 2 colorless mana. So it makes it that there is a toll to pay to attack you per creature that is going to attack you. Reap. Reap is actually part of a combo I know about to get infinite turns, so I did want to mention it here. It combines with Time Warp. Reap is, when you play it, you can get back to your hand from your graveyard up to X cards, where X is the number of black permanents an opponent controls. If you have a way of making your opponent's cards black until end of turn, you can play Reap with a second one and continually get back Time Warp and Reaps. There you go, infinite turns. And the last one I want to mention is Vati Ildal. I just wanted to mention this one because I do like him a little bit. I use him in my green-black deck. You can tap and target creature's base power or toughness, your choice, becomes 1 until end of turn. So it's a good way of shrinking someone down, especially if you have damaging spells or something to combo it in with things like giving -1/-1 counters, because it is the base number before things like counters and bonuses are applied. Now, I didn't mention a little earlier, but I did want to throw this in just because it's not as important at this point in time as the overall storyline of the Tempest block. The overall storyline of Tempest block is the Weatherlight going to Rath, journeying to rescue Captain Success, and escaping. That is the overall storyline, and each of these, shown in the books that were released, Wrath and Storm, which started with the Weatherlight saga and moved into the Wrath section. So the novel follows a whole bunch of this entire storyline, which I talked about last week. It goes into more details about it. But in this adventure, this is them arriving in Wrath and learning that this was effectively a trap to lure them here. And now they have to find a way to find where Volrath's stronghold is in order to get there and, of course, rescue Captain Success. And since the next one in the line will be Stronghold when they find it. But that's it for today. I went over this set of magic. I talked about Tempest. The storyline, it's not complex. I didn't go into huge details about it, but I went into details about the set and what they were introducing and how they were increasing the power of magic and making it a more interesting and complex game with this set. And I talked about some of the cards that were in it. So if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe to show support for the channel, the Empire, and the work I do. And of course, until the next time, I bid you farewell.